Mike Sowell knew that he had found something ironic, tragically ironic. Back in the 1980s, he was researching for his book, The Pitch That Killed, the story of Carl Mays, Ray Chapman, and the pennant race of 1920. And he came across another book called Baseball for Beginners.
It was a book on how to play baseball. It's an instructional book.
An Irish-born sports writer named John B. Sheridan had written that book. Sheridan had spent about 30 years covering the sport for newspapers in St. Louis and also writing columns for the Sporting News. In this book, Sheridan lays out guidelines for kids on how to play baseball, and he uses the game's greatest players of that era as examples of how to do it right. You know, throw a fastball like this star hurler, hit for power like this famous slugger, stand in the batter's box like this beloved Cleveland Indians shortstop.
And Sheridan used Ray Chapman as the model player for a batting stance, for being at the plate, because he had where he could cover the entire plate and, just a good position at bat, but also where he could avoid getting hit by the pitch.
On August 16th, 1920, the American Sports Publishing Company released Sheridan's book, which told youngsters that Ray Chapman had the perfect batting stance to both get a hit and avoid getting hit by a pitch. It was the exact same day that Chapman was hit by a pitch and killed by it. From WZVN Fort Myers, I'm Jeff Butera, and this is Killer Fastball. August 16th was a Monday. Carl Mays spent that Monday morning with his wife Freddie and their 3-week-old baby. He may have been despised in the baseball world. No, he was despised in the baseball world. But he was a devoted family man, too.
Carl always said that was his primary concern, was taking care of his family.
Then he drove his car to the ballpark. And Sowell says along the way he continued a peculiar superstition. He would take a chicken neck out of the icebox at his New York apartment and he'd chew it on the drive for luck. But it certainly wasn't lucky that day. The visiting Indians took the L train to the ballpark from their hotel that day, with Ray Chapman continuing his own superstition of singing to his teammates on the ride. A passenger train ride away, back in Cleveland, Chapman's wife Kathleen was pregnant, ready to move into a new house, ready to start a new family, ready for a new life with Ray possibly at home. He was considering retiring at the end of that year to go into her family's business. But the writer Phyllis Reynolds Naylor once said, "Everything can change in an instant, everything. And there is only before and after. For Carl and for Ray and for Kathleen, you could divide their lives into 2 parts. Before the 5th inning of that Indians-Yankees game on August 16th, and after." 23,000 people had piled into the Polo Grounds that day. It was so hot, 4 of them collapsed from the heat and the humidity. Most in the sweaty hometown crowd, they were rooting for the Yankees. If they won, New York would overtake Cleveland for first place in the American League. But by the 5th inning, it wasn't looking very good. The Indians had gotten to Mays for 3 runs. Cleveland led 3-0. Chapman led off the 5th. Mays was still on the mound. He went into his windup, first raising his hands over his head, then jerking both ball and glove down to the ground like he was rushing to pick up a piece of trash. The glove on his left hand stayed low, while Mays then lifted his right arm back up in the air, kind of like a crane, before plunging it back down to the earth and firing off a fastball like he was launching a catapult. As always, his knuckles nearly dragged across the ground as he flung the ball up like a slingshot heading toward home plate. But this pitch was high. This pitch was inside. This pitch was heading for Ray Chapman's head. You probably would have ducked. I probably would have ducked. But Sowell says most accounts suggest that Chapman never flinched.
Chapman did not move. He froze at the plate,
leading some to speculate that maybe he never saw the pitch. Remember, Mays had that crazy windup. Players could barely figure out where the ball was coming from. Maybe he had no idea where the ball was. Maybe. But the explanation that Sal likes best came from Chapman's teammate Terry Turner, who said Chapman probably did see the ball and recognized that the ball was going to hit him. But for some reason, he was just paralyzed, unable to move out of the way.
And he couldn't move. And he compared it to if there's a snake about to strike and you know the snake's going to bite you, but you can't move. You're just transfixed staring at this snake.
Chapman stayed crouched in his stance. And remember, he had no batting helmet on, nothing to protect him from the ball that was hurtling toward him. Although there is debate, too, about how far inside this ball really was.
The catcher swore that on this occasion, the ball was in the strike zone and that Chapman's head was actually leaned over the plate a little bit.
But it didn't matter because the umpire never got a chance to call that pitch a ball or a strike. Instead, it struck Chapman on the left side of his skull. The sound of the impact reverberated across the entire ballpark. It was a harrowing crack.
One of the Cleveland players was toweling off his face in the dugout, and he was with his back to home plate, and he said when he heard that sound, he knew something awful had happened, and he said he couldn't even look. He didn't even want to turn around and look at home plate to see what had happened. It must have been very gruesome because the sound could be heard all the way into the stands, and it actually sounded like the ball had hit the bat.
In fact, the ball bounced out to the pitcher's mound. Mays fielded it, and he threw it to first base. He thought it was a grounder off Chapman's bat. And so did many in the stands, including Chapman's brother-in-law, a teenager named Dan Daly. Dan had come to New York with the Indians team because he wanted to watch Chapman play.
He said he heard the ball hit Chapman, and he heard the sound, and he just assumed it was a bunt.
But it wasn't, and you could tell that if you looked back at home plate. Ray Chapman had fallen into a heap right there in the batter's box. His face was in agony. Sports writer Fred Lieb was there and said Chapman had blood coming from both of his ears, and his left eye was thrust from his socket. The umpire shouted out, "We need a doctor." Two of them rushed to home plate. There was a team doctor from the Yankees and Dr. Joseph Cassio from nearby St. Lawrence Hospital. He happened to be at the game that day. They did put ice on Chapman's head, and believe it or not, Chapman actually stood up. The crowd cheered. They thought he was going to be fine. He even began a slow walk out towards center field because that's where the players' clubhouse was in those days at the Polo Grounds. But he never made it to center field.
By the time he got to second base, his knees gave out and he started to fall. And then they picked him up, draped his arms around their shoulders, and they carried him the rest of the way.
In the locker room, Chapman's condition got worse. He couldn't speak. He tried to write, but the pencil fell from his hand. Still, it was clear he wanted to say something. He kept motioning at Indians trainer Percy Smallwood.
He was slurring his words, so Smallwood was having trouble understanding him, but Ray kept saying the ring, Katie's ring.
He wanted his wedding ring. An ambulance rushed Chapman to St. Lawrence Hospital. It's only about a half mile away. The doctors there and the doctors from the ballpark had already decided he needed an operation to relieve pressure on his brain. Now, there are various accounts of what Chapman said when he got to the hospital. There's even one story suggesting he said, "Tell Mays I'm all right." I actually don't buy that one. The one I do buy is the one that Mike Sal's research revealed, that Chapman told a friend at the hospital, "For God's sakes, don't call Katie. But if you do, tell her I'm all right." And that then Chapman slipped into unconsciousness. I want to pause for a second here, because before I get into what doctors realized had happened to Chapman's skull and brain, I just want to talk broadly about what can happen to anyone's skull and brain if you get hit by a baseball thrown at a high velocity.
So the impact itself of an object like a baseball causes an immediate trauma to the bone and may cause the bone to break or fracture.
That's Dr. Andrew Russman, a neurologist at the Cleveland Clinic. When I talked to him on the phone, he rattled off a half dozen ways that getting hit in the head by a ball can be really, really bad. First, there's what happens when the ball itself smashes against your skull. It can break or fracture the skull. Plus, you've got blood vessels running through your skull, and they can get damaged. Or you can have blood accumulate in your brain. That's a problem. Or maybe it's blood in a pocket of the brain, or blood all over the surface of the brain. All of those things are an issue. Perhaps you can bruise the brain tissue itself. And again, that's just from the moment that the ball bangs against your skull. There's something else, too.
When the head is struck, though, while the fracture may occur, the head decompresses around the ball, and it causes the brain, which is floating in fluid inside your head, to initially bounce in the opposite direction and bounce back.
Let me translate that. A ball hitting your skull can jostle your brain and send it hurtling toward the other side of your head. It might then hit that side and bounce back, kind of like a racquetball hitting a wall. So now you can have damage to both sides of your brain, and that's not all.
The bone fragments, when the skull strikes, can enter or depress into the brain tissue and cause injury, bleeding, bruising into the brain tissue.
Meaning the impact of the ball may send the skull itself, or even just a fragment of bone, into the brain tissue. Again, extremely dangerous. I'll add one more thing. Dr. Russman says if you're going to get hit, do it on the top part of your head. It's stronger and it's thicker up there. On the side of your head, right around your ear, you've got thinner bone and you've got arteries too. It's much more dangerous there. But that's where Chapman got hit.
Oh my gosh. That ball hit Stanton right up in the face area, it looked like. His hands covering his face. He turned into that ball, and it caught him right, it looked like, up under the helmet, and the Marlins quickly out there.
Every baseball season, a couple players do get hit in the head by a pitch. It's inevitable. You just heard probably the scariest that we've had in recent memory. It was Mike Stanton. He was still playing for the Marlins at the time, and he fractured his face when a Mike Fiers fastball rode up and in on him and crushed his cheek. But you also heard what the announcer said. You remember? The Marlins quickly out there. The trainers on the team were tending to Stanton within seconds.
Now there's a team of doctors that are available and at the field. There's typically not one, but more than one doctor present. That's a team physician who would go and immediately evaluate and perform a neurological assessment and make a determination whether there seemed like there was a significant impact-related injury.
If they need to rapidly get that player to the hospital, they can do it. If they need a trauma center that is better equipped to deal with this, they have somewhere to go. If they are worried about the stability of the spine and they need a backboard to stabilize that player, they've got one. In short, they are much better prepared for this now than they ever were 100 years ago. And they got better equipment, too.
Technologies have changed rapidly so that, in the early 1980s, we started to have CT scans now available. And that's revolutionized the evaluation of head trauma.
Because doctors can now really figure out what they're dealing with, know how serious the injury is, before they start surgery. That is a luxury that Chapman's doctors, they did not have that night. The doctor started surgery at 12:29 a.m. Indians manager Tris Speaker had signed off on them doing it because Chapman's wife hadn't arrived yet from Cleveland. Here's what the doctors found when they went in. Just about every single one of the possible problems that Dr. Russman rattled off in his interview with me, Chapman had, all of them. The impact of the ball had fractured his skull right there on the left side of his head. It was also a depressed fracture, and he had a piece of his bone that was pressing down on his brain. He had ruptured his lateral sinus, and he was struggling with blood clots, so blood was a major issue. And that part about the brain shock-waving into the skull and damaging the other side, Sal says Chapman had that too.
But it hit with such force that there was even damage to the skull on the opposite side.
Chapman definitely needed surgery, but the truth was he probably needed a miracle too. Surgeons worked on him for 1 hour and 15 minutes. They removed more than an inch of his skull, and they saw that paralysis had already started. At least when they were done, though, Chapman's pulse had gone back up. That was good news. They were actually encouraged. But that was the last encouraging thing that happened in Ray Chapman's life. It went downhill from there. And by 4:40 in the morning, He was gone. Ray Chapman was 29 years old. I told you that on Monday, Mays had played with his 3-week-old baby at his apartment before driving to the ballpark for the game. On Tuesday, Sal says Mays was back at that apartment, and there was a knock at his door. It was one of the Yankees' team secretaries, and that team secretary was nervous. He said, "Carl, I've got some bad news for you. Ray Chapman died at 5 o'clock in the morning." Mays immediately went into a daze. And he's probably unaware of the whirlwind that was about to come, and even less likely to know that his life would never be the same. Remember, before the 5th inning, after the 5th inning, everything had changed. The Indians had returned to the Ansonia Hotel after the game, and they had spent a sleepless night basically just milling about in the lobby, waiting for news from the hospital. And then word came. Their beloved teammate, the guy who was joyfully singing to them just 16 hours before, was now dead. Some of them were shocked. They were stunned. They were sobbing in mourning. But others, to be honest, they wanted revenge. Mays should be strung up was a common phrase. And it wasn't just Cleveland players who immediately wanted that revenge. In Oklahoma, there was a columnist. His name was Charles Brill. He wrote, "The blood of one of baseball's greatest and most popular stars is on Mays' hands. It would be impossible to convict Mays of murder or even manslaughter, but he is going to get his just the same. He might as well make up his mind to that." In the minds of the public, he stands convicted, Brill wrote, and the public will punish him. The punishment continued in the Sporting News in St. Louis, home to the Cardinals, but also back then, the St. Louis Browns. An editorial in that paper read, "If the news had come over the wire that a ball player had been killed by a pitched ball without naming who pitched that ball, the Browns to a man would have guessed it was Mays who did the pitching."
The Indians were convinced, and many players on other teams were convinced that Mays intended to hit him. So it's one of those questions we'll never know.
What we do know is someone had called Kathleen to tell her what had happened. She took a train from Cleveland to New York overnight, and a priest met her at the train station. She told that priest she feared something like this would happen to Ray. "We'd been too happy together," she said, "and it couldn't last." They went to the Ansonia Hotel together. They went up to manager Tris Speaker's room. No one had told Katie anything for sure, but her instincts were not wrong. "He's dead, isn't he?" she asked. Speaker never said a word. He just nodded, and Katie fainted right there in the room. Everything can change in an instant. Everything. And then there is only before and after. Killer Fastball comes to you from Waterman Broadcasting in Fort Myers, Florida. It's hosted by me, WZVN news anchor Jeff Butera. It's produced by Abigail Meyer, edited by Scott Riley, with additional voice work by Greg Parker. Next time on Killer Fastball, the funeral for Chapman, his feuding teammates, and the fight for revenge.
There was a move to run Carl Mays out of baseball.
That's episode 4 of Killer Fastball.